Back to those British airstrikes in Syria, and National Security Analyst Arash Aramesh joins us now from Los Angeles. Thank you so much for joining us. How is America reacting to the news that Britain has extended its strikes against IS into Syria?
Well, given that the Conservative Party is the governing party in the United Kingdom, Washington anticipated that this vote was probably going to go through the House of Commons with some ease. But they didn't just want to get a one-party vote. It was very nice to see 66 Labour MPs breaking ranks with the Jeremy Corbyn leadership and voting for this coalition to actually go ahead and A, support the US-led coalition, B, support a friendly ally, the Republic of France, after they came under attack by ISIS terrorists, and C, make sure that for the time being, we continue to put pressure in the means of airstrikes on ISIS, the Islamic State, in Syria and Iraq.
So do you think the vote and the airstrikes, the subsequent airstrikes, came after the Paris attacks? Do you think that these strikes now are likely to heighten the threat of terrorist attacks in the West?
You know, the threat of terrorist attacks have already been heightened. The attacks in Paris did not take place just because France is a member of this alliance. Yes, if you listen to ISIS rhetoric, that's what they would like you to believe. But regardless, we have had so many jihadis leaving the European Union from Belgium, Denmark, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, to go fight in the Syrian theater, some of whom have fought on the Iraqi side with ISIS. These guys have European Union passports. They were bound at some point to come back home. And if they are, and some of these guys are still radicalized and they're poised to strike. So for the most part, first of all, to make that argument that by attacking ISIS, it is more likely for us to be attacked, I think that's a farce. I think it's very important to continue attacking ISIS, especially through airstrikes. And now it seems like a ground component through the use of special operators, special forces is going to be in play. But without putting pressure on this ISIS Islamic State, we're going to grant them a geographical area in which they can operate, recruit, train and plan future attacks, not just in Syria and Iraq, but in the broader region and around the globe.
Arash, talking about those 200 special forces from the United States going into Iraq, and they're also going to be working in Syria, do you think we're seeing a repeat of Iraq in 2003?
No, we're not. I mean, the invasion was a 200,000 man invasion. We had several infantry divisions, mechanized divisions, you name it. Now, we're talking about a small, probably 2 company size worth of special operators going there, most likely coming from the Army. That area seems to be the Army's area of operation, most likely coming from the Ranger Regiment or detachments of the Combat Action Group, CAG Delta Force. This is not the 1st or 2nd or 3rd or 4th Infantry Divisions. This is not the 82nd Airborne. We're not talking about large divisions within the U.S. Armed Forces. So, and these guys are not there to carry out or sustain long-term military operations. They're there to pinpoint and target high-value packages, high-value targets, and also, more importantly, try to identify local forces on the ground that can help us out and also be able to train them and help them in those assaults. I don't see much of a comparison or a lot of similarities or sort of I don't think this situation is analogous to what happened in 2003, a full-scale, large invasion, and then later on an occupation of Iraq. But having said that, it's always tricky when we commit boots to the ground. Even when we commit special forces or we commit operators to the ground, we've got to make sure, well, at least we've got to be prepared to face some of the consequences in case they get killed or, God forbid, captured. But committing boots to the ground has its risks, but without doing so, especially without having, what's more important, having a reliable ally on the ground to fight this war, either the Kurds or some moderate fighting force in Syria, airstrikes alone are not going to defeat ISIS. Airstrikes are needed, they're absolutely necessary, but they're not sufficient. to destroy and finally defeat ISIS, there has to be a ground component. Hopefully, it will be a ground component composed of local forces. But again, you know, what's really tricky in Syria is that many fighting factions have similar friends and a lot of similar enemies. So a friend of a friend is not necessarily your friend. An enemy of an enemy is no longer necessarily your friend. These combos and these complex scenarios on the ground have made it very difficult for us and for you to be able to pick reliable allies on the ground to A, give them weapons and training, and B, make sure they don't alienate our allies, such as Turkey or Arab states of the Persian Gulf, or further anger and infuriate regional players, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and now with the presence of Russian forces on the ground, not to sort of get entangled with their operations.
Do you think it's possible, Arash, to pick allies on the ground, to arm, to train? Do you think that's going to happen?
It's possible, but it's unlikely. The only ground forces that come to mind that do not have an Islamist jihadi bent are the Kurds. Now, the Kurds in Syria are not exactly the same as the Kurds in Iraq. The Kurds in Iraq have been involved in a government, sort of a governing process for years now, starting in the early 90s with the no-fly zone, and then later with the liberation of Iraq and handing over power to the Kurds and the Shiites and democratically elected Sunnis in the country. The Kurds, for the most part, have been running the Iraqi Kurdistan, sort of northern parts of Iraq. It's not the same case in Syria. For the most part, a large portion of Syrian Kurds are in the northeastern province of Hasaki. Now, these forces, to some extent, have declared some sort of an autonomous region. They have fought alongside and also against the government forces of Bashar al-Assad. But what seems to unite everybody in the same line is their animosity and towards ISIS. So on the other hand, there are not really reliable moderate Islamist forces on the ground. We keep hearing the notion of moderate forces, these moderate rebels. I can think of a group. Is the Nusra Front a moderate group that is linked to Al-Qaeda? What about the Ahrar al-Sham, a sort of a coalition, or Jaish al-Fatah? Or how about the remnants of the FSA? Even within the FSA, we don't know who's fighting and who's not. It's very hard to determine whom to arm and whom to train. But again, there are outlets, but it's not impossible. It's unlikely, but not impossible. What's really important here is to find out what is our strategy towards ISIS. Are we really after destroying and defeating ISIS, period? If that is not the case, and we're after containing ISIS, or we're after minimizing their operational capabilities, their organizational and planning capacities, then we do not need a large ground component. We're going to do the job with airstrikes to keep the pressure on them, and also with special operators to pinpoint, target, and carry out small operations as deemed necessary. On the other hand, the U.S. has got to keep the pressure on our allies, on Turkey, on Saudi Arabia, on Qatar, to make sure that elements within those governments, or quote unquote charitable elements within that society, do not help radical elements in ISIS or Al-Qaeda elements. Having said all this, in a sort of a grand scheme of things, I'm very concerned about the role that Russia playing now in Syria. Your former guest, a decorated U.S. ambassador, had very good points to make. And one of the key points that I'd like to bring up is this. I get concerned where regional players or small powers misbehave. When Iran or Saudi Arabia, when they misbehave, it doesn't necessarily threaten the international system and the international order. But I get really concerned when large powers, such as the Russian Federation, when large powers with great military and political muscle misbehave. I'm in no way making a comparison to 1939, but when great powers start breaking the international order, the world has to pay a huge price for it. So I'm trying to put the ISIS situation into context here. I'm very concerned about Russia's involvement. Russia is not necessarily after destroying and defeating and fighting and combating Islamic radicalism. They're after pursuing their own interests in the region, which is to keep Assad in power, maintain their presence in Syria, expand their presence in the Middle East and also help their allies in the region, Iran and Syria. So I'm a little concerned about that. Having said all this, again, what is important to happen in Washington is this. What is our strategy? What is the end goal? We have all the tactical pieces in place, but what is the strategy? Is it to defeat ISIS or to contain ISIS? And when we have that strategy, when we have that end goal and that objective, then we can talk about costs, we can talk about tactical elements that need to be used, and then we can talk about planning and organization.
Arash, thank you so much for your insight. National Security Analyst Arash Aramesh there joining me from Los Angeles. Right.